I'm Greg Collins with Linemount.com. Today we're at the Linemount offices and we're discussing the 1963 Department of Defense contract for AR-15s, which was the first major U.S. Armed Forces contract for this rifle. And we're discussing why it was such a major milestone and how it impacted what we refer to as retro-style parts. So in 1963, the Department of Defense signed the first large-scale contract with Colt for AR-15 rifles, and this was a turning point in the evolution and fine-tuning of the design of the AR-15. A lot of what we call retro parts are either from just after the 1958 field trials, which we talked about in part 2, or are part of this 1963 contract. So the 1963 contract was for a total of 85,000 rifles for the Army and Marines and 19,000 for the Air Force. Now the contract was actually for two different versions of the AR-15. The Army and Marines received one version, which was designated the XM16E1s, and the Air Force received another version, which was the M16. Now the only difference between these two types of rifles at this point in 1963, aside from the markings, is that the Air Force version did not have a forward assist. So as you can see here, this is the forward assist. This would be a reproduction of the rifles that the Army received. Whereas this upper receiver does not have a forward assist. It's entirely slick side and back here. So this would be a version that the Air Force received. Now, the cost per rifle at this time was about $120 each. The Air Force version, without the forward assist, being slightly cheaper than the Army version. In $2,024, $120 in 1963 is roughly $1,200. So it was not exactly cheap in those days. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the forward assist, what it does is, in the scenario when the bolt does not go completely forward, so meaning does not go all the way forward due to fouling or there wasn't enough momentum on the bolt carrier or some other reason, you have to have a way to manually force the bolt to go into battery so that you can fire the round. So what we see here in this retro version is that there is a forward assist. In this retro version, as I showed before, it's with the slick side. And so now, if you've trained with the M16 in the Armed Forces, you're trained to pretty violently strike the forward assist like this if there's any issues getting the bolt into battery. The forward assist now is an interesting part because the original designer of the AR-15, Eugene Stoner, was quoted as saying he could never think of a time that anyone could use it, and just forcing a cartridge into the chamber after it had become partially stuck is a bad idea from a safety perspective. Now, presumably he meant that you might cause an out-of-battery explosion if you really jam a cartridge in there that doesn't want to be seated in the chamber without a massive amount of force. It's interesting because, in hindsight, those concerns did not turn out to be valid, because here we are in the 2020s. We have 60 years of experience using the forward assist, and in practice, the forward assist is not a part that tends to break, and it's turned out to be a fairly important addition to the rifle. And also, the Armed Forces incorporated training on its use just as standard operating procedure, mainly to address the occasional problem of the bolt not going completely into battery. Now, given that millions of soldiers have been using the forward assist for more than 6 decades, if the forward assist did create a safety issue, then we would hear about M16s blowing up all over the place, and we don't. Now, I suspect that the main reason the forward assist did not create a safety issue is that Eugene Stoner designed the AR-15 with some really significant margins of safety, particularly around preventing out-of-battery explosions. Now, what I'm about to discuss are fairly standard safety features that exist on other rifles, but it's worth reviewing. Anyway, so an out-of-battery explosion is where the cartridge is fired, but the bolt is not completely locked into the chamber. So the rapidly expanding gases might escape in other directions besides behind the bullet as it's going down the barrel. Basically, the gun blows up. It's actually extremely hard to get the AR-15 to fire a cartridge when the bolt is out of battery, and there's a few different ways that it does this. The first safety feature that prevents out-of-battery explosions is what's called a disconnector. On military rifles, you have both an automatic disconnector, also called a sear, and a semi-automatic disconnector. Now, I'm not going to go much into detail about what they do, but basically they prevent, or at least reduce the possibility, of the hammer from riding directly behind the bolt carrier as it's moving forward. The disconnectors do this for two reasons. First, you want the hammer to have enough speed to hit the firing pin with enough power to activate the primer. And the second is that you don't want the hammer hitting the firing pin unless the bolt is locked. Also, if the hammer is riding the bolt carrier or sort of freely moving inside the lower receiver, you probably get a jam too. The second important feature that prevents out-of-battery explosions is that the rear of the bolt carrier is machined, it's designed and manufactured in such a way that the hammer can't touch the rear of the firing pin unless the bolt is all the way forward. So to get a better understanding of how the bolt carrier protects the firing pin from being activated until the bolt carrier is pretty far forward, we have to take a look at an AR-15 bolt carrier here. This is the firing pin, that round mechanism right there. You can hopefully kind of see that pretty well, that round thing. This little steel ledge in the back actually protects the firing pin from the hammer until the bolt carrier is pretty far forward. So the way it would work is, as the bolt carrier is moving back and forth within the AR-15, the hammer is, if it was free within the AR-15, would actually be riding along in the back here. But it wouldn't actually have access, meaning the hammer would not have access to that firing pin until the bolt carrier was so far forward that it might actually be a little bit safer to fire. This style of safety feature is not unique to the AR-15. In fact, the AK-47 has something similar also, as do other rifle designs. The third major safety feature is that the firing pin can't completely access the primer on the cartridge unless the bolt is rotated closed. There's some pretty tight tolerances involved that require the bolt to be locked before the firing pin can actually have enough travel to activate the primer. So for a more detailed explanation of this safety feature, we're going to take a look at an actual AR-15 bolt carrier group. So in the back here, you can see we have the firing pin, and I hope you guys can see that. It's a little round thing. And I'm going to hold the firing pin and push on it as if the hammer was riding behind it and was pushing on it also. Now what you'll notice as I'm holding the firing pin forward, the firing pin will not poke out of the firing pin hole here until after the bolt is actually rotated closed. And once it's rotated closed, then it's actually safe to fire. So you can watch this area right here as I rotate the bolt closed. And you can see finally the firing pin is able to poke out. So in other words, the firing pin does not have access to the cartridge until the bolt itself is completely locked. Also, even if there is an out-of-battery explosion, the AR-15 is designed to direct the expanding gases away from the shooter. So it would go down into the magazine well and also out the ejection port. So, yes, it's theoretically riskier if you're left-handed and you're shooting it. But as I mentioned, it's an extremely rare occurrence. So Eugene Stoner really thought about safety and designed the AR-15 to be a really safe rifle for the shooter. Not so much for the guy on the other end, but even with the addition of the forward assist, because all these safety features are already incorporated into the design, in practice it doesn't really impact safety. Anyway, so the Army in 1963 absolutely set their foot down when it came to having a way to manually close the bolt, and they did this for a few different reasons. The first is that they felt that conditions in combat are often so bad, and dirty, and just muck and everything everywhere, is that So dust and dirt might get into the bolt and bolt carrier cavity in here. They also wanted a way to silently close the bolt if they needed. And with no bolt carrier assist, the only way to get the bolt carrier to close, if it doesn't close on its own, makes a lot of noise, unless you use your thumb or something to push against the recess here in the bolt carrier. And that's actually mostly a space for the dust carrier cover retainer. That's actually what it was designed for. The Air Force, meanwhile, didn't want the forward assist because they felt it was unnecessary based on some training or some testing they had done, and it added to the cost, and it was just another part that could potentially break and added expense, etc. So in the end, as the Department of Defense is looking at these two parties, the Air Force and the Army, they just threw up their hands and they just said, okay, you know what, we're just going to split the contract. Anyway, as you can see here, we have two different retro upper style receiver models that are very similar to those from the 1963 contract. One is a reproduction of the XM16E1, and one is a reproduction of the Air Force M16 upper receiver. And you can see neither of these actually have a brass deflector with a little triangle that pokes out here, which we would see in later models. Now, some other changes that came about and which were incorporated into the 1963 contract rifles are the following. There was a charging handle redesign. So the 45-degree charging handle, as you can see here, was changed to the more familiar T-style, which is a lot more comfortable. Following the 1958 field trials, the charging handle was originally located here in the carry handle area. And after the field trials, they moved it to the back of the carry handle and then started using this 45-degree style. And it's just not comfortable to use, and so they switched to this one. Also, the three-prong flash hider was modified to be a little stronger. It went from the duckbill style, as you can see here, which has fairly thin steel, to the thicker style, as you can see here. It's just a little bit more steel. It was located on the prong, so it's a little bit tougher design. Now later on, they got rid of the three-prong style entirely because this tended to snag on bushes and twigs and things like that. The other change they made was that the barrel twist was modified from 1 in 14 inches to 1 in 12 inches based on some Air Force cold weather testing that was done. Up until this point, AR-15s all had a 1 in 14 inch barrel twist. This means the bullet does one full rotation for every 14 inches of travel. Now, some of the early anecdotal combat reports from advisors in Vietnam leading into 1963 mentioned how the AR-15 would leave just gaping holes in enemies that were hit with it, like holes the size of grapefruits. So, assuming those reports were accurate, this may be because the 1 in 14 inch twist was just enough to stabilize the 55 grain bullet. So as soon as the round hit anything denser than air, like a human body, it would immediately tumble. Well, this is a problem in cold air because cold air is denser than warmer air. So accuracy in cold weather turned out not to be very good. And so the result was that they settled on a 1 in 12 inch barrel design going forward. Anyway, thanks for joining me in part 3 of the AR-15 retro parts history as we explore the really interesting history of the AR-15. If you like what you saw, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you for watching.